peace. This weekly broadcast honors the men and women from different countries and cultures who have served and fought in various ways for the peace and rights that freedom brings. There are those also who serve daily to help preserve peace and the rights that come with freedom. I call these individuals warriors for peace. This is Donna Seebo, and I will be your host for the next hour. In our world today, there is a very loud voice. I should say there are very loud voices, and they are the voices of women. From around the world, they are learning how to speak up and speak out in a way that is different from previous generations. My guest is Gayle Kimball. She is a Nautilus Award-winning author. She has written 22 books. She is very deeply involved in women's rights, in being a feminist activist, and she developed the Women's Studies program at CSUC in California. We are going to be discussing the changes that are being brought about by the younger generation of women, I should say generations, because there are always upcoming generations of women. This is about young global change makers for a feminist future. That is the title of her book. Gayle Kimball, I want to welcome you to the program.
Thank you, Donna. It's a treat to talk with you.
Gayle, this book, I feel when I was reading it, one, it's a very emotional read, but two, you are very matter-of-fact in the information that you present. And in the beginning of your book, you start out with a sentence, "The appalling state of human leadership results in the destruction of our environment and non-stop war and violence." And you then go on to state a lot of details. This book had to have taken quite a bit of time for you to put together because of all of the various women from different places in the world, different cultures, what they had to say, and not just young women, but mature women as well. This really, in a way, is a labor of activism, but at the same time, I felt like there was a very deep emotional need. It was almost like a work of love. That sounds rather melodramatic, but it's as if you're saying, let us not forget those that have gone through the challenges and continue to go through the challenges as women go through this today. But we've got to look at the future because we are seeing a battle going on here that is with the old guard, that's how I like to describe it, dying. Am I correct in my perception?
Well, since your focus is on democracy and preserving it, I think it's worth pointing out that only 20% of the world's population lives in a democratic society, and that's down from 46% in 2005. So I know if you're like me, you tend to think that we progress and that we get smarter as time goes by, but the fact is we're seeing a lot of struggles with autocratic leaders in Hungary, China, recently in Brazil, of course Russia, Putin, Turkey. So it's a struggle. And to me, the underlying problem of those autocracies is they deny human involvement in climate change. So we're actually destroying our environment, and with huge consequences that we won't be able to change if we don't take action. But the people in charge who are just concerned about money and power don't want to spend the money to change our power system.
You interviewed young women from around the world, and you say it's so important for us to listen to these young women because of what they see and what they perceive. And there is, again, it is something that is going on, and it is going on in a major, major way. And we have seen some of this evolving in the United States, especially with the overturn of Roe versus Wade.
Yeah.
And when that occurred, that was going to create a wave, really, because that ruling had freed so many women from an oppressiveness that now is sort of being encouraged to be reinstated, and yet there are people, even today as I speak, that are fighting against it. And this is something that's just a tiny indicator of what you are trying to bring forth in your book, Young Global Changemakers for a Feminist Future. This is something where too often people, when they hear the term feminist, they think it is an absolute turn against men, and it is not.
No, and you know what's interesting is the recent, yesterday, decision in the courtroom for E. Jean Carroll in her civil suit against Trump for sexually assaulting her and defamation. Of the panel, six of the 9 were men. So I think that it doesn't matter what gender you are, you can be a feminist, which means you believe in equal opportunity for everyone, and that's just basic to democracy. And I wanted to say something about your comment about it's important to listen to young people. I've done a series of books about young global youth, and I wrote one called Ageism in Youth Studies because it really surprised me that the scholars who study young people rarely talked with them, like one-on-one or open-ended questions. They relied on a lot of surveys and multiple choice questions. So an example of, I think, where they missed the boat and something we need to talk about is in the U.S. and around the world, there's anxiety and depression, mental health crisis among young people. That's really scary. And if people don't know about that, the 2023 CDC report called Youth Risk Behavior found that 57% of high school girls felt persistent sadness or hopelessness. And that was in 2021 versus 29% for boys. 1 in 3 girls had seriously considered suicide, and 13 had attempted it. A physician who was involved in the study, Kathleen Effler, said young people are telling us they're in crisis. So I think that's something that we have to pay more attention to. Our young people are really anxious about the future. We need to listen to them and take steps to ensure they don't have to worry that the environment is in jeopardy. I talked with a college class and asked them about the reasons they were so anxious, and I can share that with you if you're interested.
Yes, let's discuss that.
Okay. So they said that they have had smartphones since they were little, so they often hear depressing news. They said they had to grow up too fast, too much is expected of them. We often hear, oh, well, youth will fix the broken world we're in, and they'll save us in the future. And they're worried about climate change. The scholars tend to blame social media for youth anxiety and depression. I think that's a part of it, but I think they miss the real cause of their mental health angst, which is they feel a lot of pressure. They have way more pressure than you and I did when we were going to get into college. I went to Berkeley, and I could never have gotten into Berkeley now with my high school grades. So they have to worry about having great applications with extracurricular activities and AP courses and good grades. And then a lot of American teens are working, doing paid work as well as schoolwork and activities. So something that I think is really crucial in all this that people don't talk about is they don't get enough sleep. All the teenagers that I've interviewed in the U.S., they go to bed like at 12 or 1 because they're doing homework after they've had their activity, their extracurricular activity, or their job or something. So the students that I've talked to said, yeah, the social media makes me feel like my body isn't adequate or I don't have the right clothes. But I think that's missing the real factor, which is the pressure they have to try to succeed in such a difficult world where, housing costs are high, student loan figures, they graduate owing $30,000. It's a hard time to kind of come into the world as an adult.
One of the factors that I will bring up here is there has been a dramatic separation between older generations and younger generations. And this is something that I think the young people need to have more of that interaction with older generations, because I do not know of any generation that doesn't have difficulty. I mean, you look at, quote unquote, the greatest generation. People were out of work.
The Depression.
Yes, you had the Depression. You have the Korean War cycle. You have the Vietnam cycle. You have all of these different things just relative to our U.S. environment. So
right.
The challenges of life are always going to be there. But
yeah.
I have noticed that in my life experience that the separation of the elders from the young, this is something where the young people often do not have that older person that they can go to, that they can say, life sucks, I really don't know what to do, I'm discouraged, I'm hurting.
Right.
There's this isolation that
right.
has evolved. And when you can talk with someone that is older, and you are with them, and you are, and they say, yes, life's tough. All you have to do is go into a veterans hospital, and you'll see how tough it is. And so when you look at life with that kind of reality, and you've interviewed some young women, we're going to talk about one of them later, but what a lot of these young women in your book have gone through, and what they have experienced when they can talk with someone that has an empathy with them. Not sympathy,
right.
but empathy. And
right.
saying, okay, this is what we can do. And that's one of the messages that's coming across in the book that you have put together here. How young people, because of the fact that we have access to so much information, where in generations past, people in different countries were not heard by anybody, maybe for years, because they had no capacity for communication. And when you think of what's going out there right now, 24/7,
yeah,
365 days a year, good, bad, ugly, but most of it ugly, that
yeah.
you listen to. I know adults that are saying, I don't even want to watch the news. I'm so disgusted with the people that are putting out in media the lack of information. Where are you going to find your information? And that's the big thing, misinformation. So it doesn't
right.
surprise me, your stats, because when you're young, the only world that you know until you become educated is the box of environment that you're in. That's it. You don't know any more than that. So here we are having a discussion, and you have lived through many things. I have lived through many things. And we can say to the young generation, you have a voice. And that's what has come across in your material. The younger people are finding their voice, and they do need to have people that have walked around the block of life's experiences like yourself, and you mentioned people like Gloria Steinem, and knowing about history, knowing about the facts, digging, talking, communicating, understanding. The stories that you have in this book are so profound when you talk about a group of women in Mexico who are living in a small environment, in a small village, and they stand up against a gang of drug cartel people.
Right.
And these people are stealing their trees, and it's four women get together, and they go out, They put the guys in a place where they can't do anything, and they get the dudes out of their environment.
And they wouldn't let the men in the village kill the gangsters.
Yes.
So they threw rocks at them, and they destroyed an office building where they were housed. But they took action. There's another group like that in India called the Pink Sari Gang, where a illiterate woman whose parents wouldn't let her go to school and married her off young, she formed groups of women wearing pink saris who would take bamboo sticks and threaten wife batters, leave her alone or we're going to come as a gang. So, yeah, it's interesting when they feel like they have to use some kind of force against force rather than Gandhi's soul force, Martin Luther King's soul force. Sometimes that's an interesting thing to think about.
Yes, but the way they did it, actually, they didn't take machine guns and shoot everybody. They didn't do that. What they did is they thought very carefully about their strategies. And they said, enough is enough. And we don't need to do that anymore. And this is something where, by golly, they got together. Now, this is what I think is very important. A lot of young people try to use the shock tactics, and it will work. But the demonstrations that have been done, there are more and more people on this planet, and I speak of it in a global sense because it needs to be looked at that way. We just had a situation back in March where a man, and he's being brought up into trial, a man had brought in a bunch, it was a group of, for all intents and purposes, slaves. And they were going to be put out into, and they were being sold. So the man was captured. It took 4 agencies participating in capturing this man because he has done this to so many women as well as young boys. So this is something that is in process right now here in the Seattle area. The court process is going on right at this moment. These are things that are going on, and when we're vocal and we speak of them, and there is the action that is taken, it is significant. Now, the Dalai Lama made a comment, and this has been repeated over and over again, and this was in 2009. He said, Western women will save the world, and he described himself as a feminist.
Right.
You state this.
The context was he was at a peace conference where there were really strong, like the woman president of Ireland who was a peace activist. He was the context was he was surrounded by really powerful peace leaders who were female.
In a period of time, and you're directly involved with women's studies, and you as a professor had the challenge of being able to get this up on the college curriculum, and that was not easy for you to do. But the National Women's Studies Association was formed in 1977, and here we are in 2022. How many universities now are promoting these studies of women and their history?
Well, there are thousands of them around the world, and the Women's Studies Association includes countries in Europe, Australia, all around the world. But the really frightening thing is in Florida, the Governor DeSantis is trying to make it so you can't discuss gender or your sexual orientation or that kind of thing. So it's a rollback, and he rolled back AP course you probably read about in African American Studies. They didn't like that. They're censoring textbooks that mention slavery or civil rights efforts and that kind of thing. So I think what's important to think about is for every advance, there's a backlash. And so what we're experiencing now is has been a lot of advances in terms of women's rights, and women moving ahead, and it generates a big backlash from people who are scared about that. But you mentioned the Dobbs decision, and I think it's important to say that if they care about life, which they say is their motive, they would care about born babies. They would care about little kids. They wouldn't try to do away, as is happening in Congress now, with food stamps, SNAP program, and other kind of ways to feed kids. So it's clearly the people who passed Dobbs don't care about children. They just care about controlling women because they're afraid of equality. It threatens them. So, yeah, we're definitely in a time of backlash.
And we'll bring up the term male feminist, and this is something that is becoming very comfortable for many men, and it doesn't take away their manhood in any way, shape, or form. But there is a statement that is made by Louise Gutierrez. Humanity is male and female. Failing to integrate the male and female polarities of human nature is the most formidable obstacle to effective human agency for a fairer and more sustainable new social order. It is as if we have to go through the chaos to be able to, you might say, put into positioning the understanding that we're talking about human rights. It's not just women's rights. It is human rights. Because
and I addressed the issue of male feminists in my book that was a dialogue with men around the world about gender issues. I think we did a show on it, you and I, where we talked about it.
Mm-hmm. And this is important.
And I think what really struck me from doing this book about young global change makers for a feminist future is that there was a sense that I heard from the young women that I interviewed that there's a double standard. And I heard this everywhere, that there's a view that boys will be boys. And I think I never thought before about how profound that is, because it means boys can get away with not studying that hard at school, they can goof off, they can make jokes in class or whatever, because boys will be boys. And there's nothing similar in terms of girls will be girls. And so I think that's partly explains why the anxiety rate for girls is double. There's more pressure on them to perform and kind of be perfect. Also, the girls that I've interviewed for this book and for Climate Girls Saving Our World said that a lot of boys feel pressure to be cool, and being a tree hugger or an activist is not seen as cool. So it's kind of interesting that boys get permission to be boys, which means goof off, but on the other hand, they have a lot of pressure to be masculine and be cool, which inhibits some of their freedom of expression. So, in other words, we're still stuck in old centuries of traditional roles where what's really healthy is freedom to express all kinds of behaviors and human emotions, not inhibit just because of our gender.
You also make some comments that girls are more likely to collapse in on themselves, and this is something that Damore brought out, and boys are more likely to act out and get in trouble. And when you think about the school shootings, I don't think of one girl that's done it. It is the boys.
One.
Was there one? Was there one? Okay.
There was one in, like, Kansas or something in a religious school, and it's interesting because she was non-binary in her orientation.
Mm-hmm.
I think kind of flirted with the idea of being male, but that she's the only one that I know.
Okay, but all the rest were males.
Yep.
And every single one of them had, to the best of my knowledge, and I could be corrected on this, every single one of those males had mental issues.
Oh, yeah, you'd have to shoot little kids.
I mean, they were these were serious mental issues.
And I think a lot of them felt like they weren't cool and they were outcasts. So a lot of them are feeling anger because they don't feel cool or accepted.
And you bring the point out in research that boys are more likely than girls to be diagnosed with a behavior disorder, prescribed medications, binge drink, commit violent crimes, and commit suicide. Now, this is something, especially with COVID, with the lockdown, what they found in research was that the younger generation suffered more emotional isolation than the older generation did. Well, that wasn't a surprise because the older generation has already gone through a lot of this stuff. So they said, well, this too shall pass, but this is what we have to do. But the young people just did not have any orientation of how they could take and be okay with this.
Also, adolescence is a time of a developmental stage where you're bonding with your peers, whereas older people have already established their identity. They don't need to check it out with, am I a preppy, or am I a jock, or I'm a theater person or a drama person or whatever. So I think it was especially hard for adolescents because of that developmental stage.
Very significant. Now, in your book, you go into the research in the study of what's called civil disobedience. America was founded on civil disobedience to the British Crown. I mean, this is very, very strong in our history, and anybody who thinks it isn't, they better start getting out the history books and become acquainted with it, because that is what, I mean, even the Pilgrims, they were escaping from the environment that they did not want to be in. So this is a nation that has been founded with a lot of agitation, and we can do better. This is part of our history. You go through it from the very beginning and it is there. So civil disobedience, when it came to the women, the Susan B. Anthony, when she was doing in the 1800s, striving for the rights of women. Now, we finally got the vote in the 1920s, and with the Equal Rights Amendment, I thought had been passed, but you said no, it's still not a part of the Constitution.
No. And groups like the National Organization for Women are trying to get it through again, but the the majority party in the House doesn't want it to go through.
So here we've got a piece of information that really does make a difference. Now,
and all it says is your rights can't be abridged on the basis of your gender.
And that's important. That is important. That is very significant. Now, you talk about how women have been standing up around the world. And one of those countries was Iceland. Another was Poland. Another is Spain. Another is Argentina. And there was one that was done, and I delighted in this one, A Day Without a Woman. I thought that is something else, because this is something that needs to be understood, wherein, it takes the two. It's not just one gender. It takes all of us as a team to be able to have an infrastructure where society can be rich and successful and in harmony. It takes all of us. So
the economic system is based on having women as unpaid caregivers and child bearers and, people who staff the offices as secretaries and that kind of thing. So it's based on their lower pay or non-pay for making the system work. All the countries that you mentioned had massive strikes. So if we're thinking about how do you make change, one way is a huge demonstration on the streets and striking, not doing work. And so all the countries you mentioned did that. And Iceland was one of the first, and the U.S. did as well. And as a consequence, in Iceland, 4 years after the big strike, they got a woman president. They have all kinds of equality legislation. But that's true of all of Scandinavia. And I think what's also important to point out is not only do they have the best equality programs, in all the studies of world happiness, the Scandinavian countries are always at the top in their satisfaction and happiness. So they don't have the kind of tension, anxiety, worry, stress that we face in the U.S. because they know they're going to have good, affordable child care, good, affordable elder care. They all have health care coverage. They don't have to worry if I get cancer, I'm going to have to, sell my house or something or go bankrupt or whatever. So that the social system in the U.S. is really lags in terms of supporting equality between everyone. And the model is Scandinavia. And people will say, oh, but their taxes are so high. Our taxes are high, and they get a lot of benefits.
It's a matter of being able to come together cohesively within a nation. And the United States is huge, and there's so much diversity. And without enough real information out there, then how are we going to know when educational systems are far below the par of what they used to be? So this is something that is a huge issue as well. And this is why the voices of women and the actions of women are so significant. And it is not isolating the males. There are many men that will stand side by side with the women and say, we understand the value of this. And the adage, and Malcolm X was one, before he died, he said, when the women are brought up and when they are educated, the men benefit. So that took him a long time to get to that level, but he did. And this is something that we need to understand, and that's the equality between people. That is the equality. Yes, and you have a right. And if a girl wants to be a plumber, God bless, go be a plumber. And if a boy wants to be a dancer or wants to be in the creative arts in some way, that doesn't take anything away from him. We've got all of these false masks, false standards, that if someone is good at something, let's let them enjoy that and take pride in a level of excellence. And this goes across the board, male or female. And that has been one of the biggest scenarios because men often were prevented from going into environments that women had dominion over. And the women would say, no, you can't do that because that was their domain, like nursing and certain other areas. Forget about it. It doesn't make any difference. And women forbidden to go into many areas like medicine, etc. So all of this, let's break that down.
There used to be quotas. We can have this many women in law school, this many women in this prestigious business school, but that's all changed. And now around the world, except in sub-Saharan Africa, women are the majority of college students.
Yes, they are.
They'll be the majority of grad students. So things are definitely changing, and again, that's part of the reason for the backlash and all the Dobbs decisions and that kind of thing.
There is a young woman, and you have the stories of many young women, and you are obviously focusing on women in your book, which I think is great.
I have 3 people who are born male as well. I was looking for people who are feminists.
Mm-hmm. And there is the young woman from Afghanistan that when I read her story, I thought, this is something that was so much a part of American history. And most young women in the United States do not really know this. And a lot of what she's gone through is the same thing that women have been going through in the United States on many different levels throughout our history, dependent on where they were in the country. Now, the West Coast was much different from the East Coast. But again, it's knowing history. It's understanding that this is not something that's brand new, and it's just not isolated to a particular country. This is something we have experienced here in the United States that is a part of our history. And anybody that wants to deny it, they're they're just ignoring facts because they are there in black and white. And this has to do with so many different subject aspects. But this is Mulki Yan. I think that's her name. She's
we're using a pseudonym, and she picked Mulki, Mulki.
Okay, Mulki. All right. She was born in a remote village in Afghanistan in 1996, and her family was very poor, which I think is the general disposition of most of the people in Afghanistan, because they are landlocked. Afghanistan historically has been fought over and dominated by so many different groups throughout history. And it's because of the resources that are available in Afghanistan. And I don't recall if one of them's lithium, but there is an abundance of resources in that nation that have been fought over for years and years and years. And her dad, hard-working guy, worked in coal mines.
Right.
Sounded just like what happened in the United States. Families, fathers working in coal mines here in the United States. Many of them dying very, very young. But she was her family was the Hazara Shia Islamic religion and ethnicity. And her people, that group of people, they were very peaceful people. But they are on, for all intents and purposes, almost extinction. They were trying to exterminate them in that country. And she left Afghanistan. She and her family were able to get out, but she went back, and correct me if I'm not remembering it right, she went back to Afghanistan when she was 16.
No, you're absolutely right. What happened is that the family moved to Pakistan so her dad could work in a coal mine, and their Hazara ethnic group is a minority group. They're treated the way African Americans have been treated in the U.S. And like she feels unattractive because she has Hazara features and not the mainstream Afghan features. So but this woman, she is so amazing to me. She started speaking out for her people and speaking out for girls' access to education and go to school. And she had no support, but she, for some internal amazing source of strength, she spoke out. And she wanted to go back to Afghanistan so she could get an education, because her parents didn't feel it was safe for her to go to school in where they lived in Pakistan. So she went back to the capital and stayed in a kind of boarding house where she experienced, women being mistreated and raped and using drugs and then assaulting her when they are on drugs. She has survived so much, but she was so determined. She had to learn the Farsi, the Afghan language, in order to go to college, and she in a few months learned it. She went to college. They said, you should study computers or business or something. She said, no, I want to study political science. And she did. And then she went to work for a international NGO that focused on women's rights. And she there, too, spoke out. She said, why do you have men and women meeting in different rooms? Why don't we integrate? Why do you listen to the Western women more than you listen to the Afghan women, who are the experts on what it is to be an Afghan woman? So she is really an outspoken, brave young person. And then she had to leave along with her sister and her fiancé when the Taliban took over Kabul. And you'll read in the book, it's so dramatic how they got out and how terrible it was at the airport trying to find a ride out. So it's a really dramatic story. But they did, and they went on Spanish plane to Spain, and then really cold, cramped tent cities in the Netherlands. And then her NGO had a headquarters in Canada, so she was able to get all three of them to move to a big city in Canada, and that's where she is now. And she has work, and they have a little apartment, but she still suffers from mental health issues. She's been through so much. She's pretty anxious.
Well, and the PTSD is very, very strong when you go through situations like that, and to adapt and to adjust to the environment where you're no longer in that. It's something that some people never get through. I know.
Yes.
I know
Right.
I knew of a young man who had worked for 13 years to get out of communist Czechoslovakia, and he was able to finally get to Canada, and his story was just amazing. But he ended up going back to Czechoslovakia because he said, I don't know how to deal with freedom. It was a psyche dilemma. He couldn't, for most of his life, all of his life, prior to becoming free, as he defined freedom, prior to becoming free, he had everything told, what he could have, what he could eat.
Like being a prisoner.
Yes, and so then
to being in jail.
That's right. And even though he had fabulous support in Canada. He just I met the people that supported him and were there and just were so good. But he literally, mentally, he said, freedom. I just don't know what to do with it. I don't know what to do with it. So he ended up going back, and of course Czechoslovakia has changed too. This is something for him. It was a demonstration, and this was long before PTSD was defined as it is today. But that's exactly what he was experiencing. It was like, how do I adapt? And this is a very common experience with people who are refugees. This is not unusual. Now, one of the points I wanted to bring out about this young woman is that she said when the Taliban took over, and this is very important for people to hear, it's not going to be unusual for them to be aware of it, but to really get it from this young woman, she said, you could not trust the Taliban because this is basically a lot of young men that have no education. They don't know anything about accountability or integrity. They define everything from their perspective using their religion in whatever way that they want. And literally, they have a gang mentality. Yes. And so it's my way or the highway, and you're not going to be able to reason with them because they have been indoctrinated, but they also have that sense of, I can't be touched. Watch me roar, basically.
Right. All those boys were educated in madrasas where it was just strictly the Taliban's version of Islam, which is not the Islam of Prophet Muhammad. And so as a consequence, now girls can't go to high school, they can't go to university. Girls all over Afghanistan they really have a depression problem because their education was interrupted. I know some schools, universities are offering free internet courses, but you have to have access to internet.
Yes. And this is something where she says, this is an ideology. This is what people need to understand. And by your putting her story in your book along with other young women, this is very important. And she brings out the fact, she said, they destroyed the Ministry of Women's Affairs. Yeah. They brutally beat the journalists that are giving out facts. Yeah. She said, the boys are able to go to university, but even that is going to be very limited in what they're going to be able to learn. Right. And she said, in the Quran, Muhammad's wife was a businesswoman. Yeah. And so why is it...
rode a camel, like in Saudi Arabia, where they wouldn't let women drive. Muhammad's first wife rode a camel. His youngest wife led troops in battle. So we have... Jesus made no distinctions based on gender roles. So our Abrahamic religions and Buddhism, the early founders didn't say women's place was in the kitchen. Or women shouldn't go to school. So we need to pay attention to our roots.
I agree with that. And she talks about how she read a biography of an Afghan woman who became the first female speaker in Parliament, Fawzia Kufi, the 15th or 16th child in a family, which is mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And she found out that this person that was written about, this woman, had 8 children by the time she was 18 or 19 years old, and this girl had been given to a man who became her husband because the family didn't have enough food to eat because there were so many children in the family.
Right.
And the mother said, we had to give her to someone because we had to have some money. So they sold her. And this is something.
That happens.
Yeah, it happens. And it happens throughout the world. And that is something that engages adoption agencies. I've known of couples here in the United States that paid $50,000 to adopt a child, a baby girl from China. And others have told me stories.